My sister Victoria laughed when I inherited our grandmother's worthless 40-acre farm, but she had no idea that something extraordinary was buried beneath the old oak grove, a family secret hidden for over 60 years that would change both our lives forever. The morning fog still clung to the rolling hills of Clarksville, Tennessee, as I stood on the weathered wooden porch of what was now officially my property. 40 acres of what most people would call forgotten farmland stretched out before me, complete with a century-old farmhouse that groaned in the wind and a red barn whose paint had faded to the color of dried rust. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Marcus Thompson, and at 29, I was absolutely the last person anyone expected to inherit Grandma Eleanor's farm. For the past 8 years, I'd been serving as a combat engineer in the Army, including 2 tours in Iraq where I specialized in detecting buried explosives and hidden underground installations. Let's just say I'd developed quite an eye for spotting what others couldn't see beneath the surface. I'd been back stateside for only 6 months, picking up construction work here and there, while trying to figure out what direction my life should take next. The farm inheritance had blindsided everyone in the family, especially my older sister Victoria, who'd been expecting to inherit Grandma's valuable assets, meaning the small savings account and some antique furniture. Standing there in my worn jeans and work boots, I pulled out the letter that had been read at the will reading just 3 days earlier. Grandma Eleanor's shaky handwriting was still clear. Marcus has the patience and respect for the land that it deserves. He'll understand what needs to be done. Look for the signs I taught you to see. The problem was, I had absolutely no idea what she meant by signs. The farm hadn't turned a profit in over 20 years. The soil looked depleted, the equipment was ancient, and the property taxes alone would drain my modest savings account within 12 months. Everyone kept telling me I should just sell it to a developer and walk away with whatever cash I could get. But something kept nagging at me. Grandma Eleanor had been sharp as a tack right up until she passed at 8. She'd taught me to hunt mushrooms in these woods when I was 10, showing me how to read the land, how to spot the subtle differences that meant the difference between success and failure. The earth tells stories, Marcus, she used to say, but only if you know how to listen. The property sat on a quiet stretch of Route 149, bordered by the Henderson family's sprawling soybean operation to the north and old Mrs. Patterson's horse pasture to the south. The nearest neighbor was Tom Bradshaw, who'd been Grandma's friend for over 40 years and ran Bradshaw's Feed and Grain in town. Tom had already stopped by twice since the funeral, offering to help with anything I needed, his weathered face full of the kind of genuine concern you don't find much anymore. The farmhouse itself was built like a fortress, original oak hardwood floors that barely showed their age, thick plaster walls that kept the place cool in summer, and a mysterious root cellar that stayed at exactly 55 degrees year-round, no matter what the weather was doing outside. Grandma had always been proud of that cellar, though I'd never understood why. As I walked the property that first morning, something interesting happened. My military training kicked in without me even thinking about it. 8 years of combat engineering had rewired my brain to automatically assess terrain features, drainage patterns, and soil composition. I found myself noticing things that would have been invisible to most people: slight elevation changes, differences in vegetation density, areas where the ground felt different underfoot. That's when I noticed something peculiar about the southeast corner of the property. There, in a natural clearing, stood a perfect circle of ancient oak trees, each one easily over 100 years old. The ground inside the circle was slightly raised, maybe 2 feet higher than the surrounding area, and the grass grew with an unusual vigor, deeper green, thicker, healthier than anywhere else on the property. In Iraq, elevated ground with different vegetation patterns usually meant one thing: something was buried underneath that was affecting the soil chemistry. My pulse quickened as I knelt down and examined the earth more closely. The soil here wasn't just different, it was rich, dark, and had a mineral content that didn't match the rest of the farm. I was still kneeling there, running the dirt through my fingers, when I heard the unmistakable sound of an expensive German engine and tires crunching on gravel. My sister Victoria's silver BMW was pulling into the driveway, and from the aggressive way she was driving, This wasn't going to be a social visit. Victoria stepped out of her car like she was walking into a courtroom, her designer heels clicking against the gravel with sharp, impatient sound. At 32, she was everything I wasn't: a successful real estate attorney in Nashville, impeccably dressed, financially secure, and absolutely convinced that our grandmother had lost her mental faculties in her final year. She surveyed the property with the kind of disdain usually reserved for crime scenes, her perfectly styled hair catching the morning sunlight, as she shook her head in what appeared to be disbelief. Victoria had been fighting the will for 3 days straight, convinced there had to be some legal angle to overturn what she saw as an obviously irrational decision. As she approached, her expression made it clear that she'd driven all the way from Nashville for one purpose: to convince me that keeping this worthless farm was the biggest mistake I could possibly make. She had no idea that in the next few minutes, she was about to say something that would set in motion a chain of events leading to the discovery of a family secret that had been hidden beneath our feet for over 60 years. Little did either of us know that our grandmother's cryptic words about looking for signs were about to make perfect, extraordinary sense. Part 2. The Confrontation. Victoria's heels struck the gravel like a judge's gavel as she marched toward me, her perfectly tailored navy blazer and cream silk blouse looking completely out of place against the rustic farm backdrop. She carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from winning courtroom battles and closing million-dollar real estate deals, but there was something else in her expression, a barely contained frustration that had been building for 3 days. "Marcus," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone she'd perfected over years of legal practice, authoritative, slightly condescending, and designed to make the other person feel like they were already losing an argument they hadn't even started yet. "We need to talk." I stood up slowly, brushing the rich, dark soil from my hands, and turned to face my sister. The contrast between us couldn't have been more stark. Me in my faded jeans and work boots, dirt under my fingernails, while she looked like she'd stepped out of a legal magazine photo shoot. "Victoria," I replied evenly, keeping my voice neutral. 8 years in the military had taught me the value of staying calm when someone was obviously spoiling for a fight. "Wasn't expecting to see you so soon." Her laugh was sharp and humorless. "Oh, I bet you weren't. Did you really think I was just going to let this ridiculous situation slide?" She gestured sweepingly at the property, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the morning sunlight. "Look at this place, Marcus. It's a dump. The house is falling apart. The land is worthless, and you're out here playing in the dirt like some kind of farmer." The way she said farmer made it sound like a disease. Grandma Eleanor obviously wasn't thinking clearly in her final months. Victoria continued, pulling out her phone and scrolling through what looked like legal documents. "I've been researching the property values in this area, and this land is worth maybe $3,000 an acre on a good day. That's $120,000 total, minus the cost of demolishing that ancient house and clearing all this junk." She waved dismissively at the old farm equipment and the barn that had stood for over a century. "Meanwhile," she said, her voice gaining the rhythm of a closing argument, "I've already had 3 different developers contact me about purchasing the estate. They're willing to pay $250,000 cash, sight unseen, just for the development potential. We could split that money, and you could use your half to get a real start on your civilian life, instead of trying to play Little House on the Prairie out here." I felt a familiar tension building in my shoulders, the same feeling I used to get in Iraq when someone was pushing too hard too fast without understanding what they were really dealing with. "Victoria, the will was pretty clear. The will was the product of an elderly woman who was clearly not competent to make such decisions," she interrupted, her attorney voice in full swing now. "I've spoken with 3 different legal experts about challenging it on the grounds of diminished capacity. We have a solid case." That's when something shifted inside me, hearing my sister casually dismiss Grandma Eleanor's mental state. The same grandmother who had taught me to read the stars, who could still beat me at chess right up until the month before she died, who had written me letters full of sharp wit and family stories throughout both my deployments, triggered something protective and fear. "Grandma Eleanor was sharp as a tack, and you know it," I said quietly, but with an edge that made Victoria's eyes narrow slightly. "Oh please," she scoffed. She was 89 years old, living alone on this isolated farm, probably hadn't had a real conversation with anyone besides that old fool Tom Bradshaw in months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. People that age lose perspective, Marcus. They make irrational decisions based on sentiment, instead of logic. She pulled up something else on her phone, turning the screen toward me. Look at this. I've already found a law firm in Nashville that specializes in will contests. They think we can have this overturned within 6 months, especially if we can prove she was suffering from early-stage dementia or was unduly influenced by someone. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a brush fire. Are you suggesting I manipulated a 89-year-old woman? I asked, my voice deadly quiet. Victoria's smile was razor-thin. I'm suggesting that maybe spending all that time in a war zone affected your judgment about what's appropriate when dealing with vulnerable elderly relatives. Maybe you convinced yourself and her that you deserved something you clearly aren't equipped to handle. That was the moment Victoria crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Not only was she attacking Grandma Eleanor's memory and mental capacity, but she was also implying that my military service had somehow damaged me, made me manipulative, untrustworthy. You have no idea what you're talking about, I said, my military bearing automatically straightening, my voice taking on the tone I'd used when giving orders to my engineering unit. But Victoria was on a roll now, sensing what she thought was weakness. Look around you, Marcus. Look at this place. You've been here what, 3 days, and you're already acting like some kind of gentleman farmer. You don't know the first thing about agriculture, about managing property, about turning a profit from land. You're going to lose every penny you have trying to make this work. And for what? Some romantic notion about honoring Grandma's memory. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a reasonable, sisterly tone. I'm trying to save you from yourself here. Take the developer money, split it with me like family should, and use your half to do something sensible. Get some training, start a real career, maybe even go back to school. Stop this foolish fantasy before it ruins your life. What Victoria didn't understand was that her words weren't discouraging me. They were confirming something I'd suspected since reading Grandma Eleanor's letter. My grandmother had known exactly what she was doing when she left me this farm. She'd known Victoria would react exactly like this, with dismissal and legal threats, and attempts to overturn her final wishes. But she'd also known something else. She'd known that I would understand the real value of this land in a way that Victoria, for all her legal expertise and financial success, never could. As I stood there listening to my sister systematically tear down everything our grandmother had built and believed in, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. I was going to find out what Grandma Eleanor had hidden beneath that circle of oak trees, and I was going to prove that sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be measured in dollars and cents. Victoria, I said quietly, my eyes moving past her to the southeast corner of the property where the ancient oaks stood in their perfect circle. I think you're about to be very surprised by what this worthless farm is actually worth. Victoria's perfectly manicured eyebrows shot up at my words, but before she could launch into another legal argument, I was already walking toward the house. Where are you going? She called after me, her heels clicking frantically on the gravel as she tried to keep up with my determined stride. To get some tools, I replied without looking back. If you're so convinced this farm is worthless, then you won't mind if I do a little digging to prove you wrong. I could hear her muttering something about stubborn military types and wasting time on fantasies, but I was already focused on what I needed from the old tool shed behind the barn. Grandma Eleanor had kept her equipment in immaculate condition, and I quickly found what I was looking for, a professional-grade metal detector that looked surprisingly modern among the vintage farm tools. Marcus, this is ridiculous. Victoria called out as I emerged from the shed with the metal detector and a sturdy spade. You're going to tear up the property based on some sentimental nonsense about hidden treasure. This isn't a pirate move, but I was already heading toward the southeast corner of the property, where that perfect circle of ancient oak trees stood like sentinels guarding their secret. Victoria followed reluctantly, her designer heels making the walk across the uneven terrain a precarious adventure. Look, she said, slightly out of breath as we reached the edge of the oak grove. Even if there was something buried out here, which there isn't, you can't just start excavating without proper permits. There are environmental regulations, historical preservation laws. Victoria, I interrupted, kneeling down to examine the metal detector settings. For someone who's so eager to sell this place to developers, you're suddenly very concerned about regulation. The metal detector was a high-end model, the kind used by serious treasure hunters and archaeological teams. As I calibrated it, I noticed something interesting scratched into the battery compartment in Grandma Eleanor's careful handwriting. For Marcus, when you're ready to listen to what the earth is telling you. My heart started beating faster. She had planned. Somehow she had known I would need this exact tool, at this exact moment, to understand what she'd been trying to tell me. I turned on the detector and began sweeping it slowly across the raised ground within the circle of oaks. For the first few minutes, nothing but the occasional beep indicating small metal debris, probably old fence staples or horseshoe nails. "This is embarrassing," Victoria said, checking her phone. "I have a conference call with clients in 2 hours, and I'm standing in a field watching my brother hunt for buried treasure like some kind of..." The metal detector erupted in a symphony of electronic alerts. I froze, staring at the device's display. The readings were off the charts, indicating a large, dense metal object, approximately 3 feet below the surface, stretching across an area roughly 6 feet by 4 feet. This wasn't a horseshoe or a lost tool. This was something substantial. "What is?" Victoria asked, her tone shifting from dismissive to curious despite herself. I moved the detector in a systematic grid pattern, mapping the outline of whatever lay beneath our feet. The object was rectangular, metallic, and based on the detector's readings, it was old, buried long enough for the surrounding soil to have settled completely around it. "Victoria," I said quietly, "I need you to call Tom Bradshaw and ask him to bring his backhoe." "His what?" she said, but she was already moving closer, watching the metal detector's frantic display with growing fascination. "His backhoe. The small excavator he uses for digging fence post holes and clearing drainage ditches. Tell him it's important, and ask him to bring some of his farm hands too. We're going to need witnesses for this." "Witnesses for what, Marcus?" "You found some old farming equipment buried in the ground. Big deal." But I could hear the uncertainty creeping into her voice. The metal detector didn't lie, and the readings we were getting suggested something far more significant than discarded farm machinery. While Victoria made the call, I continued mapping the buried object. It was positioned almost exactly in the center of the oak circle, and the more I studied the site with my engineer's eye, the more deliberate everything looked. The trees hadn't grown randomly, they'd been planted in that specific pattern. The raised ground wasn't natural, it was carefully constructed, and the way the object was oriented, perfectly aligned with magnetic north, suggested military precision. Tom Bradshaw arrived within 30 minutes, his ancient but well-maintained backhoe rumbling behind his pickup truck. He brought 2 of his farmhands with him, Jake Morrison and Pete Santos, both local men who'd known our family for decades. "Marcus," Tom said, his weathered face serious as he surveyed the scene, "your grandmother made me promise something before she passed. She said, if you ever came out here with that metal detector and found what she thought you'd find, I was supposed to help you dig it up properly." Victoria's mouth fell open. She knew, Grandma Eleanor knew there was something buried here? Tom nodded slowly. "She knew a lot of things, Miss Victoria. Things she never talked about, even to me. But she made me swear that when the time came, I'd help Marcus do this right." As Tom positioned the backhoe and began the careful process of removing the topsoil, a small crowd began to gather. Word travels fast in rural Tennessee, and soon Mrs. Patterson from the neighboring horse farm had arrived, followed by a couple of the Henderson boys, all drawn by curiosity and the unmistakable sound of excavation equipment. The first 2 feet of soil came up easily, revealing the carefully layered earth that indicated this site had been deliberately prepared decades ago. At 3 feet down, the backhoe's bucket scraped against something hard and metallic. "Stop," I called out, jumping down into the shallow excavation. "From here we go by hand." What we uncovered over the next hour changed everything Victoria thought she knew about our grandmother, our family, and the true value of this worthless farm. It was a military-grade storage container, approximately 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, made of reinforced steel, and sealed with a watertight gasket that had somehow remained intact after more than 60 years underground. The container bore markings that made my blood run cold. U. Army, Classified Materials, 1943. The silence around the excavation site was so complete you could hear the distant sound of Mrs. Patterson's horses whinnying in their pasture. Victoria knelt beside me at the edge of the pit, her expensive blazer now dusty and forgotten, her entire worldview shifting with each detail we uncovered about the mysterious container. 1943, Tom Bradshaw said quietly, reading the faded military markings. That's right, in the middle of World War II. Your grandmother would have been... He paused, calculating. She would have been about 20 years old then. I ran my hands along the container's edges, looking for the opening mechanism. My combat engineering training had familiarized me with military storage systems, and this was definitely government issue, built to last and built to keep secrets. Along one side, I found what I was looking for, a heavy-duty locking mechanism that required a specific tool to open. We need bolt cutters, I announced. Heavy-duty ones. This lock system is designed to prevent casual access. Jake Morrison jogged back to Tom's truck and returned with a pair of industrial bolt cutters. As I positioned them on the lock, Victoria grabbed my arm. Wait, she said, her voice tight with anxiety. Marcus, what if this is something dangerous? What if it's, I don't know, chemical weapons or explosives or something that should have stayed buried? I paused, considering her concern. It was actually the first completely reasonable thing she'd said all day. If Grandma Eleanor left specific instructions for me to find this, she wouldn't have put me in danger. She was too careful, too protective of family. But I also understood Victoria's worry. Military containers from 1943 could contain anything from documents to experimental materials that were better left undisturbed. However, the careful way this had been buried, the deliberate placement within the oak circle, and the modern metal detector left specifically for me to find, everything suggested this was meant to be discovered, not hidden forever. With everyone stepping back to a safe distance, I cut through the lock mechanism. The container's lid was heavy, requiring both Tom and me to lift it properly. As it opened with a soft hiss of air that had been sealed inside for over 60 years, the contents took my breath away. The container was lined with oiled canvas and divided into several compartments. The largest section contained what appeared to be dozens of leather-bound journals, their pages yellowed but perfectly preserved. Smaller compartments held photographs, maps, and official documents bearing military seals and signatures. But it was the top layer that made Victoria gasp out loud. Nestled in custom-fitted foam were approximately 24 military medals and decorations, including several I recognized as among the highest honors the U.S. military could bestow. Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, a Silver Star, and in the center, wrapped in protective cloth, a Medal of Honor, the nation's highest decoration for valor in combat. This isn't possible, Victoria whispered, staring at the medals. Grandma Eleanor was never in the military. She was a farm wife, a homemaker. She never even talked about the war except to say it was a terrible time. I carefully lifted one of the journals and opened it to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably our grandmother's, though younger and more confident than the shaky script I remembered from her final years. The entry was dated March 15, 1943, and began codename Nightingale. Assignment: Operation Torch Intelligence Gathering, North Africa. Tom Bradshaw's weathered face had gone pale. Son of a gun, he muttered. She was a spy. As I continued reading, the pieces began falling into place. Eleanor Morrison, our grandmother's maiden name, had been recruited by the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, while working as a translator for the War Department. Her language skills, her unremarkable appearance, and her ability to blend into civilian populations had made her perfect for intelligence work in occupied Europe. The journals documented her activities across 3 years and multiple theaters of operation. She had parachuted into Nazi-occupied France twice, coordinated with resistance fighters in Italy, and spent 6 months undercover in a German-held Belgian town gathering intelligence on troop movements and supply lines. The medals weren't just hers, they had been awarded posthumously to agents who had worked under her command, men and women who had died in service to their country and whose families had never been told the true nature of their sacrifice, because the operations remained classified. "Look at this," I said, carefully unfolding a document that bore the seal of the President of the United States. It was a personal commendation from Franklin D. Roosevelt himself, praising Agent Nightingale for extraordinary heroism and invaluable service to the Allied cause. Victoria was frantically reading through another journal, her legal training helping her quickly process the technical language and code references. "Marcus, according to this, she saved the lives of over 200 Allied soldiers by providing intelligence that allowed them to avoid a German ambush in 19. The photographs told the story in stark visual terms. Our proper grandmother, always dressed in floral dresses and sensible shoes in our memories, appeared in these images wearing military fatigues, standing with groups of hard-faced soldiers, rappelling down cliff faces, and meeting with European resistance leaders in shadowy buildings. In one particularly striking photo, she was shaking hands with General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who had written on the back, "To Agent Nightingale, with gratitude for service above and beyond. DI. This explains so much," Tom said, shaking his head in amaze. Why she never talked about the war years, why she always seemed to know things before anyone else, why she was so good at reading people. She was trained to observe, to analyze, to keep secrets. But the most remarkable discovery was in the final compartment of the container. Wrapped in oiled cloth were deeds and property documents dating back to 1945, showing that our grandmother had used her military back pay and government bonuses to systematically purchase land throughout Tennessee and Kentucky. What appeared to be a single 40-acre farm was actually part of a carefully assembled portfolio of properties spanning 3 states. The documents revealed mineral rights, timber contracts, and lease agreements that had been generating income for decades. Income that had been quietly accumulating in a series of trust accounts managed by a law firm in Nashville. The firm's most recent statement, dated just 2 months before Grandma Eleanor's death, showed a total value of over $2.8 million. Victoria stared at the financial documents with the expression of someone watching their entire understanding of reality crumble. She wasn't a simple farm wife, she said in a dazed voice. She was a war hero. She was wealthy. By letting everyone think she was just an ordinary grandmother living on a struggling farm, she kept us safe from attention we didn't want or need. But she made sure that when the time was right, when someone she trusted would know what to do with this legacy, the truth would come out. As the sun began setting over the Tennessee hills, casting long shadows across our remarkable discovery, Victoria looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, genuine respect, mixed with amazement, and perhaps a touch of shame. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I owe you an apology, and I owe Grandma Eleanor one too, though I guess it's too late for that." But I was already thinking beyond apology. Our grandmother had left us more than money and property. She had left us a responsibility to honor the memory of all the unknown heroes whose medals lay in that container, and to use our newfound resources to continue the kind of quiet service that had defined her extraordinary life. Part 5. The Legacy. 3 weeks after our discovery, the old farmhouse buzzed with activity that would have made Grandma Eleanor both proud and slightly amused. Victoria had taken a leave of absence from her Nashville law firm and was currently sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by historical documents and military records, working with researchers from the National Archives to properly catalog our grandmother's wartime service. The transformation in my sister had been remarkable. The same attention to detail and fierce determination that had made her a successful attorney was now focused on ensuring that Agent Nightingale's story was told with the respect and accuracy it deserved. She'd already contacted 3 different military historians and was coordinating with the Pentagon to have some of Grandma Eleanor's previously classified missions officially recognized. "Marcus, you need to see this," Victoria called out, her voice carrying an excitement I hadn't heard since we were kids finding Easter eggs. She held up a letter that had arrived that morning from the Department of Defense. "They want to award Grandma Eleanor a posthumous Distinguished Service Cross, Apparently her work saved not just those 200 soldiers I found in the journal, but potentially thousands more. I looked up from the financial documents I'd been reviewing with Tom Bradshaw and the trust attorney who'd driven down from Nashville. The numbers were still staggering. Decades of carefully managed investments, mineral rights that had been quietly producing income, and property holdings that stretched across 3 states. Our worthless farm was actually the center of a portfolio worth nearly $3 million. But the money, as significant as it was, had become secondary to something far more important. We'd become the guardians of a story that needed to be told, and the caretakers of a legacy that extended far beyond our family. Tom adjusted his reading glasses and pointed to a particular entry in the trust documents. Your grandmother was something else, Marcus. Look at this. She'd been donating anonymously to veterans organizations for over 40 years. The VFW in town, the Wounded Warrior Project, families of soldiers killed in action. She never took credit for any of it. The local community had rallied around our discovery with an enthusiasm that bordered on the miraculous. Mrs. Patterson had organized a committee to establish a memorial garden in the oak grove where we'd found the container. The Henderson family had volunteered their equipment to help restore the farmhouse to its original condition. Even the mayor of Clarksville had driven out to discuss establishing the property as a historical site. But perhaps the most meaningful response had come from an unexpected source. 3 days after news of our discovery spread through local veterans networks, an elderly man named Frank Castellano had arrived at our door. At 94, he was one of the last surviving members of the resistance network that Grandma Eleanor had worked with in occupied France. I never knew her real name, Frank had told us, his voice thick with emotion as he studied the photographs from the container. We called her the Angel because she appeared out of nowhere when we needed her most, and disappeared just as quickly. She saved my life in Lyon, got me out when the Gestapo was closing in. Frank's visit had led to connections with other survivors and their families across Europe. Through Victoria's legal contacts and my growing network of military historians, we'd begun piecing together the full scope of Grandma Eleanor's wartime activity. The picture that emerged was of a woman who had consistently put herself in extreme danger to save others, never seeking recognition or reward. The farmhouse itself had become a kind of informal museum. The root cellar that had always stayed mysteriously cool turned out to be the entrance to a hidden radio room, where Grandma Eleanor had maintained contact with Allied command throughout the night. The equipment was still there, carefully preserved and apparently operational according to a ham radio expert who'd driven over from Memphis. Victoria emerged from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee and settled into the chair across from me. The designer suits and stiletto heels had been replaced by jeans and work boots, and she'd never looked more like family than she did in that moment. I've been thinking, she said, pouring coffee for Tom and the attorney, about what we should do with all this, the money, the property, the store. I'd been thinking about the same thing. The discovery had changed more than our understanding of Grandma Eleanor. It had changed our understanding of ourselves and our responsibilities. I want to establish a foundation, something that honors her memory and continues the work she was doing. Support for veterans' families, educational programs about World War II intelligence operations, maybe scholarships for young people interested in military service. Victoria nodded, pulling out a legal pad covered with her neat handwriting. I've been researching the requirements for that. We could endow it with a significant portion of the estate and still have plenty left for our own needs, but I think it should be more than just a foundation. She gestured toward the window, where we could see the oak grove and the memorial garden taking shape. This place needs to become a real historical site. People should be able to come here and learn about the ordinary Americans who did extraordinary things during the war. Not just Grandma Eleanor, but all the people like Frank Castellano, who risked everything for freedom. Tom cleared his throat. If you're serious about that, I know some folks who could help. My nephew works for the Tennessee Historical Society, and there are federal programs that support educational sites like what you're describing. The attorney, a man named David Chen who specialized in estate planning and charitable foundations, looked up from his note. What you're proposing is absolutely feasible. With an endowment of this size, you could create something that would operate in perpetuity. The foundation could manage the historical site, fund educational programs, and provide ongoing support for veterans initiatives. As the afternoon wore on and our plans became more concrete, I kept thinking about that final letter Grandma Eleanor had left. the one that had started this whole journey. Look for the signs I taught you to see, she had written. I was beginning to understand that the real treasure hadn't been the money, or even the historical artifact. The real treasure was the responsibility she had passed on to us, the obligation to remember the sacrifices of those who served in silence, to honor the courage of ordinary people who did extraordinary things, and to ensure that their stories weren't lost to time. Victoria was on her phone with someone from the Smithsonian, discussing the possibility of displaying some of Grandma Eleanor's medals and documents in a traveling exhibition about women in World War II intelligence operations. Tom was sketching out plans for expanding the memorial garden to include recognition for other local veterans. As the sun set over the Tennessee hills, casting the same golden light that had illuminated this land for over a century, I realized that Grandma Eleanor had given us something more valuable than money or property. She had given us purpose, and a way to honor not just her memory but the memory of all the unsung heroes whose sacrifices had preserved the freedom we too often took for granted. The worthless farm that Victoria had laughed at was becoming the foundation for something that would touch lives for generations to come, and somewhere, I liked to think, Agent Nightingale was smiling at how perfectly her final mission had been accomplished. Part 6. The Foundation. 6 months after our discovery, I stood in the same spot where Victoria had first laughed at my inheritance, but the transformation was so complete that the old farm seemed like a memory from another lifetime. The Eleanor Nightingale Morrison Veterans Heritage Center was scheduled to open to the public in just 2 weeks, and the anticipation throughout Tennessee and beyond was building to something I never could have imagined. The farmhouse had been meticulously restored to its 1940s appearance, with each room telling a different part of the story. The kitchen where Grandma Eleanor had decoded messages looked exactly as it had during the war, complete with period-appropriate furniture and a hidden compartment behind the pantry where she'd stored classified documents. The living room displayed her medals alongside photographs and personal accounts from the soldiers and resistance fighters whose lives she had saved, but it was the underground radio room, accessed through the root cellar, that truly captured visitors' imagination. Military communications experts had helped us restore the original equipment to working condition, and twice a week, licensed ham radio operators would demonstrate how Agent Nightingale had maintained contact with Allied command across thousands of miles of enemy territory. Victoria emerged from the visitor center, a beautifully designed building that had been constructed where the old barn once stood, carrying a thick folder of correspondence. Her transformation from dismissive attorney to passionate historian had been so complete that the local newspaper had featured her in a story about career reinvention at any age. "Marcus, you won't believe this," she said, her voice bubbling with excitement. "I just got off the phone with a documentary filmmaker from the History Channel. They want to feature Grandma Eleanor's story in a series about women spies of World War II. But that's not even the best part." She pulled out a letter bearing the seal of the French government. "The French ambassador to the United States is coming to the opening ceremony. They're awarding Grandma Eleanor the Croix de Guerre posthumously, and they want to present it to us on behalf of the French resistance fighters she worked with." Tom Bradshaw appeared around the corner of the house, leading a group of visitors on one of his popular Neighbors Perspective tours. At 73, he'd become the center's most requested guide, sharing stories about the mysterious woman he'd known as simply Eleanor for over 40 years, never suspecting her extraordinary wartime past. "And over here," Tom was telling the group, "is where Marcus first used that metal detector." None of us knew what we were about to find, but looking back, all the signs were there. The way she always seemed to know things before anyone else, the way she could read people, that root cellar that stayed cold in the summer. The Eleanor Morrison Foundation had exceeded our wildest expectations in its first 6 months of operation. Using a significant portion of the estate's value, we'd established programs that were already making a difference in veterans' lives across the region. The scholarship program had awarded its first grants to 12 young people pursuing military service or careers in intelligence and national security. The Family Support Network was providing assistance to over 200 veterans' families dealing with everything from PTSD counseling to financial hardship. But perhaps the most meaningful program was the Hidden Heroes Project, which Victoria had developed to research and recognize other veterans whose wartime service had never been publicly acknowledged. Working with military archives and veteran organizations, The Foundation had already identified 17 other World War II intelligence operatives, whose stories deserved to be told. Frank Castellano, now 95, had become the Foundation's honorary ambassador, traveling despite his age to speak at veteran events across the country. His first-hand accounts of working with Agent Nightingale had been recorded for the Smithsonian's Oral History Project, ensuring that these stories would be preserved for future generations. "You know what amazes me most?" Victoria said as we walked toward the memorial garden, where the original oak trees now stood surrounded by commemorative stones honoring local veterans from all conflicts. "It's not just the money she left us, or even the historical significance of what she did. It's how she managed to live a completely normal life while carrying all these secrets." The memorial garden had become a place of pilgrimage for veterans' families from across the region. Patterson, now 82, had donated additional land to expand the garden, and the Henderson family had provided the equipment to create walking trails that wound through the property's most beautiful area. At the center of the garden stood a bronze statue of a woman in 1940s dress, her face turned toward the horizon, representing all the unnamed heroes who had served in silence. The inscription, taken from one of Grandma Eleanor's journal entries, read, "True service asks for no recognition, but history remembers those who answer when freedom calls." The economic impact on the local community had been extraordinary. The Heritage Center was drawing thousands of visitors annually, leading to the establishment of new restaurants, bed and breakfasts, and tourist services throughout Clarksville. Tom's Feed Store had become an unofficial information center, with visitors stopping by to hear his stories about the mysterious neighbor who had turned out to be a war hero. The success had attracted attention from other communities with hidden historical treasure. Victoria had been contacted by families across the country who suspected their own relatives might have similar untold stories from the war years. The Foundation was developing a consultation service to help other communities research and preserve their local military history. "I keep thinking about that first day," Victoria said as we paused beside the statue. "How certain I was that this place was worthless. How convinced I was that you were making a mistake by keeping it." She pulled out her phone and showed me a message that had arrived that morning. "This is from a woman in Oregon whose grandfather worked with Grandma Eleanor in Italy. She's 89 years old and has been carrying his war stories for decades, afraid to tell them because everything was classified. Now she wants to come here and share what she knows." The Heritage Center's research library had become a repository for similar stories. Documents, photographs, and personal accounts arrived weekly from families who had finally found a place where their loved ones' wartime service could be properly honored and preserved. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the memorial garden, I thought about how dramatically our understanding of family legacy had changed. 6 months ago, Victoria had seen only financial value in land and property. Now we both understood that the greatest inheritance Grandma Eleanor had left us wasn't measured in dollars, but in the responsibility to honor those who served and to ensure their sacrifices weren't forgotten. The opening ceremony in 2 weeks would feature representatives from 5 different countries, veteran organizations from across the United States, and families of intelligence operatives who had finally found a place where their stories could be told. But for me, the most important attendees would be the local families who had supported our vision from the beginning, proving that sometimes the most valuable treasures are discovered not by looking for gold, but by learning to see the extraordinary in what others dismiss as ordinary. Standing in the shadow of those ancient oak trees, I realized that Grandma Eleanor's final mission was still unfolding, touching lives in ways she never could have imagined when she carefully buried that container more than 60 years ago. The morning of the Eleanor Nightingale Morrison Veterans Heritage Center's grand opening dawned, crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect Tennessee autumn weather that seemed orchestrated by someone who understood the significance of the day. By 8 a.m., cars were already lining Route 49 for nearly a mile in both directions, and volunteer parking attendants were directing overflow traffic to the temporary lots the Henderson family had prepared in their adjacent fields. I stood on the farmhouse porch, adjusting my dress uniform for the 3rd time, watching as a steady stream of visitors made their way toward the memorial garden where the dedication ceremony would take place. The sight was both overwhelming and deeply moving. Families carrying photographs of their own veteran relatives, elderly men and women wearing service ribbons from conflicts spanning 8 decades, and young people who had traveled from across the country to honor the memory of a woman they'd never met, but whose story had inspired them to learn more about their own family histories. Victoria appeared beside me, elegant in a navy dress that struck the perfect balance between formal respect and approachable warmth. She carried a leather portfolio containing the remarks she would deliver as the foundation's president, but I could see her hands trembling slightly with nervous energy. "I still can't believe this many people came," she said, watching as a bus from the Nashville Veterans Administration pulled into the main parking area. The RSVP list said 800, but Tom thinks there might be over 1,200 people here. The guest list read like a who's who of military history and international diplomacy. The French ambassador, Pierre Dubois, had arrived the evening before and spent 2 hours in the restored radio room, speaking in hushed, reverent tones about the debt his country owed to operatives like Agent Nightingale. Colonel Sarah Martinez from the Pentagon's Historical Services Division was representing the Secretary of Defense. 3 different members of Congress had made the trip, along with the governors of Tennessee and Kentucky. But the guests who mattered most to me were the ones who didn't appear on any VIP list. Frank Castellano sat in the front row of the Memorial Garden, now 95 but determined to honor the woman who had saved his life in occupied France. Beside him sat Maria Santos, whose grandfather had worked alongside Grandma Eleanor in the Italian resistance, and who had flown in from Oregon with a suitcase full of letters and photographs that would become part of the Heritage Center's permanent collection. Tom Bradshaw, wearing his best suit and the Korean War Service medals he rarely displayed, was serving as master of ceremony. His voice carried across the assembled crowd as he began the program with a moment of silence for all veterans who had served in secrecy, their sacrifices known only to God and country. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom announced, his weathered voice strong despite his 73 years, "we gathered today not just to honor one remarkable woman, but to remember all the quiet heroes who answered their country's call without expectation of recognition or reward." The ceremony began with the presentation of colors by an honor guard from Fort Campbell, followed by the national anthem performed by the Tennessee State University Choir. As the final notes echoed across the hills, I felt the weight of the moment settling over the assembled crowd like a blessing. Victoria stepped to the podium, her nervousness transformed into passionate conviction as she began her remark. "6 months ago, I stood in this very spot and told my brother that our grandmother's farm was worthless. I was looking at 40 acres of tired land and seeing only financial liability. I was wrong about everything that mattered." Her voice carried clearly through the sound system as she told the story of our discovery, of the container buried beneath the oak trees, and of the extraordinary woman whose secret life had been hidden in plain sight for over 60 years. The crowd was silent, captivated by the tale of transformation, not just of the farm but of our entire understanding of family, legacy, and the true meaning of service. "Eleanor Morrison taught us that the most valuable inheritance isn't measured in dollars," Victoria continued, "but in the responsibility to honor those who served and to ensure their sacrifices are never forgotten. Today, we dedicate this center not just to her memory, but to all the hidden heroes whose stories deserve to be told." Ambassador Dubois spoke next, his accented English adding gravity to his words about the debt France owed to Agent Nightingale and her fellow operative. He presented the Croix de Guerre posthumously, and as Victoria and I accepted the medal on our grandmother's behalf, I could feel the presence of everyone she had saved, everyone she had protected, everyone whose life had been touched by her courage. The most powerful moment came when Frank Castellano was helped to the podium. His voice was thin but determined as he shared his memories of the woman he had known only as the Angel. "In 1944, I was 19 years old and trapped in Lyon when the Gestapo was closing in on our resistance cell," he said, his words carrying across the silent crowd. "This woman appeared out of nowhere, led us through the sewers to safety, and disappeared again before dawn. I never knew her real name, never saw her again, but I lived to marry my sweetheart, to raise 4 children, to see my grandchildren grow up. Everything good in my life for the past 80 years exists because of her courage." As Frank was helped back to his seat, there wasn't a dry eye in the memorial garden. The statue of the unnamed woman looking toward the horizon seemed to capture perfectly the quiet strength of all those who had served without recognition. The final speaker was Maria Santos, whose grandfather's letters had provided crucial details about Grandma Eleanor's work in Italy. She announced that her family was donating his entire collection of wartime documents to the Heritage Center's research library, ensuring that future historians would have the resources they needed to tell these important stories. As the formal ceremony concluded with the playing of taps and the presentation of an American flag that had flown over the Capitol in honor of Agent Nightingale, the assembled crowd moved through the Heritage Center in small groups. Children pressed their faces against the display cases containing medals and photographs. Teenagers asked thoughtful questions about code-breaking and resistance operations, and elderly veterans shared their own stories with younger visitors eager to learn. Standing in the radio room where Grandma Eleanor had once coordinated with Allied Command, I watched as a young Army intelligence officer demonstrated the vintage equipment to a group of fascinated middle school students. One girl, maybe 12 years old, raised her hand and asked, "Did she ever get scared?" The officer smiled and pointed to one of Grandma Eleanor's journal entries displayed on the wall. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's doing what needs to be done despite the fear." As the afternoon sun began to set over the memorial garden, casting the same golden light that had illuminated this land for generations, I realized that our grandmother's final mission was now truly complete. The secret she had kept buried for 60 years had blossomed into something that would touch lives for generations to come, ensuring that the sacrifices of hidden heroes would never be forgotten. Victoria joined me on the farmhouse porch as the last visitors made their way to their cars, both of us exhausted but deeply fulfilled by the day's success. "She would have been proud," Victoria said simply, and for the first time in months I heard peace in her voice. Looking out over the memorial garden where hundreds of people had gathered to honor courage and sacrifice, I knew she was absolutely right. 1 year after the dedication ceremony, I stood in the same kitchen where Grandma Eleanor had once decoded secret messages, but now it served as the nerve center for something that had grown far beyond anything we'd imagined. The Eleanor Morrison Foundation had become a national model for veteran heritage preservation, and the ripple effects of our discovery were touching lives across the globe in ways that still amazed me daily. Victoria burst through the front door, her arms full of mail and her face bright with excitement. The daily correspondence had become so voluminous that we'd hired 2 full-time staff members just to handle the letters, documents, and research requests that arrived from around the world. "Marcus, you have to see this," she said, dropping the mail on the kitchen table and pulling out a thick package from the pile. "This came from a family in Poland. Their grandmother worked with resistance fighters during the Warsaw Uprising, and they think she might have crossed paths with our grandmother." The package contained photographs, letters, and documents that had been hidden in an attic for over 70 years. Similar packages arrived almost weekly now. Families who had heard our story and finally felt safe sharing their own family's wartime secrets. Researchers uncovering connections between various intelligence networks, and historians piecing together the broader picture of civilian resistance operations. The Heritage Center had become an unexpected hub for international research collaboration. The University of Tennessee had established a graduate program in intelligence history, with students coming from universities across Europe and North America to study the documents in our research library. The Smithsonian had created a traveling exhibition based on Grandma Eleanor's story, which was currently touring military museums in 12 states. "Look at this timeline," Victoria said, spreading out a large chart that one of the graduate students had been working on. "They've identified at least 47 other operatives who worked in the same networks as Grandma Eleanor, 47 people whose families probably have no idea what their relatives really did during the war." The Hidden Heroes Project had become the Foundation's most impactful program, working with military archives, veteran organizations, and international research institutions. We'd helped over 200 families uncover the truth about their relatives' wartime service. Each discovery led to more connections, more stories, and more families finally understanding why their grandparents had carried certain secrets to their grave. Tom Bradshaw appeared in the doorway, now officially the Heritage Center's Director of Community Relations, though he still preferred to think of himself as just a neighbor who tells stories. At 74, he'd become something of a celebrity in veteran circles, invited to speak at military academies and historical conferences about the importance of preserving local military history. "Marcus, "We've got a situation," Tom said with a grin that indicated it was a good kind of situation. Channel 7 wants to do a follow-up story on the economic impact. Apparently, tourism revenue in Clarksville has increased by 400% since we opened. The economic transformation of the region had been extraordinary. The Heritage Center drew over 50,000 visitors annually, leading to the opening of 6 new hotels, 12 restaurants, and dozens of shops specializing in military memorabilia and local crafts. The Henderson family had converted part of their farm into a venue for military reunions and veteran events. Mrs. Patterson had opened a bed and breakfast that was booked solid 6 months in advance, but the economic benefits, significant as they were, paled in comparison to the educational and emotional impact. The center's youth programs had introduced thousands of young people to the stories of World War II intelligence operations. The scholarship program had awarded grants to over 100 students pursuing careers in military service, intelligence work, or historical research. Victoria's phone rang, and I could hear the excitement in her voice as she answered. After a brief conversation, she hung up with an expression of wonder that had become familiar over the past year. "That was the State Department," she said. "They want to use our model to help establish similar heritage centers in other countries. Apparently, the French government is so impressed with what we've accomplished that they're creating their own program to honor resistance fighters and intelligence operatives." The international attention had been overwhelming but deeply gratifying. Delegations from France, Belgium, Norway, and the Netherlands had visited the center to learn about our research methods and community engagement strategies. The Polish embassy had announced plans to create a similar center honoring resistance fighters from the Warsaw Uprising. The most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source. The CIA had quietly reached out through official channels to discuss declassifying some of Grandma Eleanor's mission reports for inclusion in the center's historical collection. While much of her work would remain classified indefinitely, they were willing to release enough information to provide context for the artifacts we'd found. "There's something else," Victoria said, pulling out another letter from the mail pile. "This one's from the granddaughter of someone who worked with Grandma Eleanor in Belgium. She's driving down from Michigan next week with her grandfather's war diary. Apparently he wrote about the American angel who helped coordinate their escape. Each new connection felt like another piece of a vast puzzle clicking into place. The underground networks that had seemed like isolated cells were revealing themselves to be part of a sophisticated, interconnected system of resistance and intelligence gathering that had spanned continents. Frank Castellano, now 96 but still determined to honor the woman who had saved his life, had become the center's most requested speaker. His monthly talks drew audiences from across the region, and his recorded interviews were being used by universities and military academies as primary source material for their World War II curricula. The radio room had become particularly popular with ham radio enthusiasts and communication students. Twice a week, volunteer operators would make contact with similar heritage sites across Europe, creating living connections between the places where Grandma Eleanor and her fellow operatives had once worked. "You know what amazes me most?" Victoria said, as we walked through the memorial garden, now expanded to include recognition stones for all the operatives we'd identified through our research. "It's not just that she kept these secrets for 60 years, it's that she somehow knew that eventually, someone would be ready to tell these stories properly." The garden had become a place of pilgrimage for veteran families from across the country. Almost daily, someone would arrive with flowers to place at the memorial statue, or with a photograph of their own relative to add to the memory wall that had grown to include hundreds of images of hidden heroes from all conflicts. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the memorial stones, I thought about how profoundly our understanding of legacy had changed. What had started as a simple inheritance dispute had become a mission to preserve the stories of courage and sacrifice that might otherwise have been lost forever. The worthless farm that Victoria had once mocked had become the seed for a movement that was helping families across the globe understand and honor their own hidden heroes. And somewhere, I was certain, Grandma Eleanor was smiling at how perfectly her final operation had succeeded in ways she could never have imagined. The ripple effects were still spreading, touching new lives every day, ensuring that the sacrifices of those who served in silence would be remembered and honored for generations to come. 5 years after that first day when Victoria laughed at my inheritance, I stood in the newest addition to the Eleanor Morrison Veterans Heritage Center, a state-of-the-art research library and educational complex that had become the premier destination for military history scholars from around the world. But today wasn't about international recognition or academic achievements. Today was about something far more personal and meaningful: the next generation of our family discovering their own connection to this extraordinary legacy. My 8-year-old nephew, David, Victoria's son, sat cross-legged on the floor of Grandma Eleanor's restored radio room, completely mesmerized as Frank Castellano, now 98 but still sharp as a tack, demonstrated how the vintage equipment worked. David's questions came rapid-fire, each one more sophisticated than the last. "Mr. Frank, how did great-great-grandma Eleanor know the codes weren't being intercepted by the Germans?" David asked, his young mind grappling with concepts of wartime espionage that most adults found difficult to understand. Frank's weathered face lit up with delight. "Well, young man, that's exactly the kind of question your great-great-grandmother would have asked. She was always thinking 3 steps ahead, always planning for what could go wrong." Victoria watched from the doorway, her expression a mixture of pride and amazement. Her son had been visiting the Heritage Center regularly since he could walk, but recently his casual interest had transformed into genuine passion for understanding his family's hidden history. "I still can't believe he's so interested in all this," Victoria said quietly as we watched David carefully examine one of the vintage radio components. "Last week he asked his teacher if he could do his school report on women in World War II intelligence operations. When she said yes, he spent 3 hours interviewing Mrs. Santos about her grandfather's work with the Italian resistance. The educational programs we'd developed over the past 5 years had reached over 100,000 students, but seeing our own family's next generation engage with this history felt profoundly different. David represented something we hadn't anticipated when we first uncovered that buried container: the possibility that Grandma Eleanor's legacy would inspire future generations of our own family to understand the importance of service and sacrifice. Tom Bradshaw entered the radio room, carrying a large box of newly arrived documents. At 76, he remained the heart and soul of the Heritage Center, though we'd finally convinced him to accept a team of assistants to help manage the ever-growing collection of artifacts and testimony. "Marcus, you're going to want to see this," Tom said, setting the box on the table with reverent care. "This package came from the family of a British SOE operative who worked with Eleanor in France. They found his entire war diary in their grandfather's effects, and it's full of references to Agent Nightingale. The Special Operations Executive Diary was a treasure trove of previously unknown details about Grandma Eleanor's work behind enemy lines. But what made this discovery particularly special was the timing. It had arrived just as we were preparing for the center's 5-year anniversary celebration, an event that would bring together the largest gathering of intelligence operation families we'd ever hosted." David looked up from the radio equipment, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Uncle Marcus, does this mean there are still more secrets to discover about great-great-grandma Eleanor?" "Probably," I said, kneeling down to his level. "Your great-great-grandmother was part of a very large network of brave people. Every time we learn something new about one person, it helps us understand the others better too." Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message, and her face broke into a huge smile. "David, your cousin Emma is here with Aunt Sarah. Want to show them the new artifacts." My sister Sarah had driven down from Kentucky with her 10-year-old daughter Emma, who had inherited the family's apparent fascination with puzzle solving and historical mystery. The two cousins had become regular research partners, spending hours poring over documents and photographs, asking questions that often stumped the graduate student. As the children ran off to explore the new SOE documents, Victoria and I settled into the comfortable chairs we'd placed in the radio room for moments like this. Quiet conversations about how far we'd all come and where we were heading next. "I've been thinking about something," Victoria said, pulling out a folder she'd been carrying. "The foundation has been so successful, and we've helped so many families discover their own hidden heroes, but I wonder if we're missing something closer to home." She opened the folder to reveal a collection of more recent photographs and documents. "I've been researching our family's military service beyond just Grandma Eleanor's story. Did you know we have relatives who served in Korea, Vietnam, and Desert Storm. People whose stories we've never really explored because we were so focused on World War II. The realization hit me immediately. In our excitement about uncovering Grandma Eleanor's extraordinary wartime service, we'd overlooked the possibility that other family members might have their own untold stories of service and sacrifice. "Look at this," Victoria continued, showing me a photograph of a young man in Vietnam-era Army fatigues. "This is Mom's brother, Uncle Robert. He died in Vietnam when I was 2, and we never really knew much about his service. But I found this letter in Mom's things when she passed. It's from one of his fellow soldiers, thanking him for saving their lives during an ambush." The photograph showed a young man who looked remarkably like me, wearing the same kind of serious expression I'd seen in my own military photo. But it was the letter that truly caught my attention, a handwritten account of courage under fire that echoed the themes of selfless service we'd discovered in Grandma Eleanor's story. There might be a whole family tradition of quiet heroism that we never fully understood, I said, studying the document. Maybe what we found buried under those oak trees wasn't just Grandma Eleanor's secret. Maybe it was the key to understanding something much larger about who we are as a family. David and Emma burst back into the radio room, their arms full of maps and photographs from the SOE collection. "Uncle Marcus, Aunt Victoria, look what we found," Emma announced excitedly. "There's a map that shows all the places great-great-grandma Eleanor worked, and some of them are the same places where Uncle Robert was stationed." The children had made a connection that the adults had missed. The map Emma held showed intelligence operation routes through Southeast Asia during the 1940s, routes that would later become strategically important during the Vietnam conflict. As I looked at my nephew and niece, their young faces bright with the excitement of discovery, I realized that Grandma Eleanor's greatest legacy wasn't the money she'd left us, or even the heritage center we'd built. Her greatest legacy was the example she'd set for future generations, the understanding that true service often goes unrecognized, that courage comes in many forms, and that the most important battles are sometimes fought by people whose names never appear in history books. The next generation of our family was already learning these lessons, not through lectures or textbooks, but through the direct experience of uncovering family history and understanding the weight of the sacrifices that had been made on their behalf. Standing in that radio room where Grandma Eleanor had once coordinated with Allied Command, surrounded by my family and the physical evidence of courage that spanned generations, I understood that we weren't just preserving the past, we were inspiring the future. 10 years after Victoria first laughed at my inheritance of a worthless farm, I stood once again beneath the ancient oak trees where our extraordinary journey had begun. But this time, I wasn't alone with a metal detector and unanswered questions. This time, I was surrounded by over 2,000 people who had gathered from around the world to witness something unprecedented in the history of military intelligence: the declassification and public release of Operation Nightingale's complete mission files. The ceremony was being broadcast live to military bases, veterans centers, and heritage sites across 6 countries. Camera crews from major networks had positioned themselves throughout the memorial garden, capturing every moment of what historians were already calling one of the most significant intelligence document releases since the end of the Cold War. Victoria stood at the podium that had been erected in the center of the oak grove, her silver hair catching the morning sunlight as she prepared to read from the official CIA declassification order. At 42, she had become one of the nation's leading advocates for veteran recognition and historical preservation, her transformation from dismissive attorney to passionate historian complete in every way that mattered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd, "today marks not just the 10th anniversary of the Eleanor Morrison Veterans Heritage Center, but the completion of a promise made 79 years ago by a young woman who believed that someday, when it was safe to do so, the full truth about her service could finally be told." In the front row, David, now 18 and preparing to enter West Point in the fall, sat next to his cousin Emma, 16 and already accepted into Georgetown's International Relations program. Both young people had spent their formative years immersed in the stories of hidden heroes, and both had chosen career paths that honored their family's tradition of service. Frank Castellano, now 101 and one of the last living people who had worked directly with Agent Nightingale, sat in a place of honor beside the memorial statue. His presence was a living link to the events that were about to be officially revealed, and his emotional reaction to each new detail being disclosed was captured by dozens of cameras documenting this historic moment. Tom Bradshaw, at 81, still serving as the Heritage Center's Director Emeritus, stepped forward to introduce the CIA's Deputy Director for Historical Collections, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who would oversee the formal document release. The friendship between Tom and me had deepened over the decade, built on shared amazement at how far we'd all come from that first day when three curious neighbors had watched me dig up a mysterious container. "The documents we're releasing today," Walsh announced, "represent the most complete intelligence operation files ever made available to the public." Operation Nightingale involved 127 agents working across 14 countries, and their combined efforts are credited with saving an estimated 50,000 Allied lives and shortening the European conflict by an estimated 6 months. The gasps from the crowd were audible as the true scope of Grandma Eleanor's network was revealed for the first time. What we had always understood as individual acts of heroism were now shown to be part of a coordinated intelligence operation of unprecedented scale and effective. Emma raised her hand during the Q&A session that followed, her question capturing the attention of intelligence historians and military officials alike. "Dr. Walsh, the documents show that Agent Nightingale continued working for the CIA through the 1950s, well after the war ended. Why did she stop? And why did she choose to hide her service for so long?" Dr. Walsh smiled, clearly impressed by the sophistication of the question. According to her final debrief, Agent Nightingale requested termination of her active service when she married and decided to start a family. She specifically asked that her identity remain classified until enough time had passed that revealing it wouldn't endanger any surviving agents or compromise ongoing operations. The answer revealed something we had never fully understood about Grandma Eleanor's decision to keep her wartime service secret. It wasn't shame or trauma that had kept her silent, it was continued concern for the safety of others, even decades after the war had ended. David stood up next, his West Point bearing already evident despite his youth. "Sir, the documents mention something called the Nightingale Protocol. Can you explain what that was?" "The Nightingale Protocol," Walsh replied, "was a communications and extraction system developed by Agent Nightingale that became standard operating procedure for deep cover intelligence operations. Elements of that protocol are still classified and continue to be used by intelligence services today." The revelation that our grandmother's innovations were still protecting modern intelligence operatives sent a wave of pride through our family section. Victoria wiped away tears as she realized that Eleanor's legacy of protecting others had never truly ended. The formal document release included over 3,000 pages of mission reports, photographs, and correspondence. But the most moving discovery was a personal letter that Grandma Eleanor had written to be opened only when her service was declassified. Victoria read it aloud to the assembled crowd. "To my family and to all who hear this story, I never sought recognition for my service, but I always hoped that someday the truth could be told, not to glorify my action, but to honor the memory of the 227 brave men and women who worked alongside me. Many of them never came home. All of them deserved better than to have their sacrifices forgotten. If my story helps people remember theirs, then keeping the secret for all these years will have been worthwhile." As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, I found myself walking through the Heritage Center complex that had grown far beyond anything we'd imagined a decade earlier. The original farmhouse now anchored a campus that included research libraries, educational facilities, and memorials honoring hidden heroes from conflicts spanning nearly a century. The economic impact on the region had been transformational, with Clarksville becoming known worldwide as a center for military history and veteran heritage tourism. But more importantly, the educational impact had touched over 500,000 students, inspiring countless young people to learn about service, sacrifice, and the importance of preserving important stories. Victoria joined me as I paused beside the memorial statue, both of us reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought us to this moment. The sister who had once mocked my inheritance of a worthless farm now oversaw a foundation with an endowment exceeding $50 million. Dedicated to preserving the stories of veterans whose service had gone unrecognized. You know what I think about Victoria said as we watched David and Emma leading a group of younger visitors through the radio room. It's not what we found buried under these trees, or even what we built because of it. It's what Grandma Eleanor knew that we didn't, that the most valuable things in life aren't measured in dollars, but in the impact we have on others. As the sun set over the Tennessee hills, casting the same golden light that had illuminated this land throughout our grandmother's long life, I realized that the circle was finally complete. The secret she had kept for nearly 8 decades had become a legacy that would touch lives for generations to come, ensuring that the sacrifices of hidden heroes would never be forgotten. The worthless farm had become priceless in ways that no financial assessment could ever measure, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures are discovered not by looking for gold, but by learning to see the extraordinary courage hidden within ordinary lives. 15 years after that first morning when I stood on the porch of what Victoria had dismissed as a worthless farm, I found myself in the newest wing of the Eleanor Morrison Veterans Heritage Center, the International Intelligence Museum, which had just been designated as an official UNESCO World Heritage Site. The recognition placed our little Tennessee farm alongside historic sites like the Tower of London and Normandy Beach, acknowledging its global significance in preserving the stories of hidden heroes from around the world. The autumn air carried the sounds of construction as workers put the finishing touches on the newest addition, the Agent Nightingale Research Institute, a state-of-the-art facility that would house the world's most comprehensive collection of World War II intelligence documents. Graduate students and postdoctoral researchers from 37 countries had already applied for fellowship positions at the institute, making it clear that Grandma Eleanor's legacy had evolved far beyond family history into genuine academic and historical significance. Victoria emerged from the institute's main building, her hair now completely silver but her energy as boundless as ever. At 47, she had become an internationally recognized expert on wartime intelligence operations, with her book The Hidden Network, Agent Nightingale and the Secret War, having been translated into 16 languages and adapted into a major motion picture that was currently filming on location at the Heritage Center. "Marcus, you won't believe what just happened," she said, her voice filled with the same excitement that had characterized her discoveries for the past 15 years. "I just got off the phone with the Prime Minister of Norway. They're dedicating their new Resistance Museum to Grandma Eleanor and want us to help design their exhibits." The international reach of our grandmother's story had continued to expand exponentially. Similar heritage centers had been established in France, Belgium, Poland, and most recently the Philippines, where newly discovered documents revealed that Agent Nightingale had also worked in the Pacific Theater during the final months of the war. David appeared around the corner of the building, now 23 and a newly commissioned second lieutenant in Army intelligence, fresh from his graduation from West Point. His senior thesis on modern applications of World War II intelligence protocols had earned recognition from the Pentagon and resulted in his assignment to the newly created Historical Intelligence Analysis Division, a unit that studied past operations to improve current tactics. "Uncle Marcus, Aunt Victoria, I have news," David said, his military bearing now natural and confident. "The Army has approved my request to establish a formal liaison program between active intelligence units and heritage sites like ours. They want to use historical case studies to train modern operatives." The idea that our Heritage Center would become an active training site for current intelligence professionals represented the ultimate validation of everything we'd built. Grandma Eleanor's techniques, preserved in the declassified documents, would now help protect a new generation of those who served in secret. Emma joined us from the Memorial Garden, where she'd been leading a delegation of high school students from 6 different countries through the exhibit. At 21, she was completing her master's degree in international relations at Georgetown while serving as the Heritage Center's youth education director. Her fluency in 4 languages and her passion for cross-cultural understanding had made her the perfect ambassador for the center's expanding international program. "The students from Japan just made the most incredible connection," Emma announced, pulling out her tablet to show us photographs and documents. They discovered that one of their grandfathers worked with the same resistance network in the Philippines that great-great-grandma Eleanor coordinated with. They want to establish a sister heritage site in Tokyo. The global network of connected heritage sites had become one of our most successful initiatives. Young people from around the world were discovering that their own families had hidden stories of courage and sacrifice, and they were using our model to preserve and share those stories in their home country. Tom Bradshaw, now 86 but still sharp and actively involved in the center's daily operations, approached our group carrying a letter that had arrived in the morning. His role had evolved over the years from local neighbor to internationally recognized expert on grassroots historical preservation, and he'd been invited to speak at universities and military academies across 3 continents. "This one's special," Tom said, handing me the letter with a smile that indicated another remarkable discovery. "It's from a family in Australia. Their grandmother was a radio operator who received transmissions from Agent Nightingale during the Pacific operation. They want to donate her entire collection of coded messages and equipment to our research institute." The steady stream of discoveries had never slowed. Each declassified document, each family's donated artifacts, each survivor's testimony added new pieces to the puzzle of wartime intelligence operation. The Research Institute's database now contained over 100,000 documents related to resistance and intelligence activities, making it the world's premier resource for scholars studying clandestine operations. Frank Castellano, now 6 and one of the oldest living World War II veterans, continued to make monthly visits to the Heritage Center despite his advanced age. His presence had become almost mythical among visitors, who considered themselves extraordinarily fortunate to meet someone who had actually worked alongside Agent Nightingale in occupied Europe. "Mr. Frank is in the radio room with a group of West Point cadets," Emma reported. "They're absolutely mesmerized by his stories about using the equipment under combat conditions." One of them asked if he'd ever been afraid, and he said every day, "But Agent Nightingale taught us that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about doing what needs to be done despite the fear." The educational impact of the Heritage Center had grown beyond anything we'd imagined possible. Over 1 million students had participated in our programs, with many going on to careers in military service, intelligence work, diplomacy, or historical research. The scholarship program had awarded grants to over 500 young people, creating a network of alumni who were serving in positions of responsibility around the world. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message, and her face lit up with delight. "The documentary about our family's story just won the Emmy for Outstanding Historical Documentary. They want us to attend the award ceremony next month." The media attention had been constant but largely positive, helping to spread awareness about the importance of preserving veteran stories and recognizing the contributions of those who served in secret. The Heritage Center had been featured in National Geographic, the History Channel, the BBC, and countless other outlets, always with the message that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary courage when called upon to serve. As we walked through the memorial garden, now expanded to include recognition for hidden heroes from conflicts spanning nearly a century, I reflected on how completely our understanding of family legacy had changed. The financial inheritance that Victoria had once coveted seemed insignificant compared to the responsibility we'd inherited to preserve and share stories of courage and sacrifice. The latest addition to the garden was particularly meaningful, a section dedicated to modern-day heroes who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, including several veterans who had been inspired by Agent Nightingale's story to share their own experiences of service and sacrifice. "You know what I think Grandma Eleanor would be most proud of?" Victoria said as we paused beside the original memorial statue. "Not the international recognition or the academic accolades, but the fact that we've helped over 1,000 families discover and preserve their own hidden hero story." As the evening shadows began to lengthen across the Tennessee hills, I realized that the worthless farm Victoria had once mocked had become something truly priceless, not because of its financial value, but because of its power to inspire people around the world to recognize and preserve the stories of those who had served in silence. The living legacy of Agent Nightingale continued to grow with each passing day, touching new lives, inspiring new discoveries, and ensuring that the sacrifices of hidden heroes would never be forgotten. 20 years after Victoria first laughed at my inheritance, I stood in the original farmhouse kitchen where this extraordinary journey had begun, but this time the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation and mystery. A cryptic letter had arrived that morning, postmarked from Switzerland, written in Grandma Eleanor's unmistakable handwriting, but dated just 3 months before her death. The impossible timing of its arrival, exactly 2 decades after our first discovery, suggested that our grandmother had orchestrated one final revelation from beyond the grave. Victoria sat at the old kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she held the letter that had somehow been delivered through a Swiss law firm with instructions to mail it precisely 20 years after Eleanor Morrison's death. The envelope bore an official wax seal and the notation, "Final Testament, to be opened only by Marcus and Victoria Thompson, October 15, 2043. How is this even possible?" Victoria whispered, her voice filled with awe and uncertainty. "She died 20 years ago. How could she have known we'd still be here, still running the Heritage Center, still discovering new pieces of her story?" David and Emma had driven down from their respective military and diplomatic postings to be present for what we all sensed would be a momentous revelation. At 28 and 26, they had become leaders in their own right. David as a major in Army intelligence, specializing in historical analysis, Emma as a rising star in the State Department's Cultural Heritage Protection Division. Tom Bradshaw, now 91 but still mentally sharp despite his failing eyesight, sat in his familiar chair by the window. Over the decades, he had become our family's honorary grandfather, the keeper of local memories and the bridge between the past and present. His presence for this moment felt essential, as if Grandma Eleanor herself had planned for him to witness her final secret. "Read it aloud, Victoria," I said quietly. "Whatever she's telling us, we should hear it together." Victoria carefully opened the envelope and unfolded what appeared to be multiple pages of our grandmother's careful handwriting. Her voice was steady but emotional as she began, "My dearest Marcus and Victoria, if you are reading this letter, then my calculations were correct, and 20 years have passed since you first discovered the container beneath the oak tree. By now you have learned much about Agent Nightingale and the work we did during the war. You have built something beautiful and meaningful from those discoveries, and I am proud beyond words of what you have accomplished." Victoria paused, wiping away tears that had begun flowing at the sound of our grandmother's voice reaching across 2 decades through her written words. "But there is one final secret I could not risk revealing while any of my fellow operatives were still alive. The last of them, according to my calculations, should have passed away within the past few years, making it safe at last to share the complete truth." Emma leaned forward, her diplomatic training evident in her careful attention to every word. She was still protecting other people's secrets even in her final testament. Victoria continued reading. "The Operation Nightingale files that were declassified 10 years ago told the story of our wartime activities, but they did not reveal the full scope of what we accomplished. There is a second cache far more significant than the first, buried in a location that I could only reveal when enough time had passed to ensure that its discovery would not endanger anyone still living." The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the old mantel clock that had belonged to Grandma Eleanor's mother. The idea that there was another buried treasure, another secret that had remained hidden for 8 decades, was almost too extraordinary to comprehend. The second cache contains not just documents and artifacts, but something that the Allied governments agreed must remain secret until all possibility of retaliation or political complications had passed. It contains the complete records of Operation Looking Glass, a post-war intelligence operation that prevented what could have been a Third World War. David's military training made him the first to grasp the implication. "Uncle Marcus, if there was a post-war operation that prevented another global conflict, and it's been kept secret for 80 years, the historical significance would be immeasurable," Victoria finished, her legal mind already processing the ramifications of such a discovery. Grandma Eleanor's letter continued with specific instructions for locating the second cache. It was buried beneath what appeared to be a natural rock formation in the hills behind the Heritage Center,
land that had been part of the original farm property but had never been developed or thoroughly explored. The Swiss bank that delivered this letter also holds additional documents that will only be released once you have successfully located and excavated the second cache. These documents will provide the complete context for what you find, including the names and locations of other families around the world who were part of this extended operation. Tom spoke for the first time since Victoria had begun reading, his aged voice carrying the weight of decades. Your grandmother always said this land had more stories to tell, even after all these years, even after everything we've discovered. She was still keeping one more secret to protect people she cared about. The letter concluded with coordinates that, when David plotted them on his military GPS device, pointed to a location approximately half a mile behind the Heritage Center, in an area we had always assumed was just natural woodland. There's something else, Victoria said, reading the final paragraph. She writes, "This discovery will complete the circle of truth that began with your first excavation. It will also provide the resources necessary to expand the Heritage Center's mission beyond anything you have yet imagined. But most importantly, it will prove that the work we began during the war continues to this day, carried forward by those who understand that true service transcends generations." As we sat in the fading afternoon light, processing the magnitude of what our grandmother had revealed, I realized that after 20 years of discoveries, revelations, and global recognition, we were about to embark on the most significant excavation. The worthless farm that Victoria had once mocked was apparently hiding secrets that could reshape our understanding of post-war history. Emma pulled out her phone to contact the State Department's Archaeological Division, while David began coordinating with military historians who would need to oversee the excavation of classified material. Victoria started making calls to the international network of Heritage Center partners who would want to witness this historic moment, but as the sun set over the Tennessee hills, casting familiar shadows across the land that had already given us so much, I couldn't help but wonder what other secrets our remarkable grandmother had taken to her grave, and whether this would truly be her final surprise or merely the latest chapter in a story that seemed to have no end. The next morning we would begin the excavation that would either complete our understanding of Agent Nightingale's legacy, or open entirely new chapters in a story that had already exceeded our wildest imagination.
The excavation of the second cache began at dawn on a crisp October morning that seemed charged with historical electricity. Unlike our first discovery 20 years earlier, this time we were accompanied by a full archaeological team from the Smithsonian, military historians from the Pentagon, and representatives from the State Department's Classified Materials Division. The coordinates from Grandma Eleanor's posthumous letter had led us to what appeared to be a natural limestone outcropping, but ground-penetrating radar had revealed a sophisticated concrete vault buried 15 feet beneath the surface. Victoria stood beside the excavation site, now 52 and serving as the official liaison between our family and the various government agencies overseeing the dig. Her transformation from skeptical attorney to passionate historian was now complete, but today she carried herself with the gravity of someone who understood that we were about to uncover something that could reshape modern understanding of Cold War history. "The concrete structure is military grade," announced Dr. Sarah Chen, the lead archaeologist. "Based on the construction materials and techniques, this vault was built sometime between 1947 and 1950, using specifications that suggest it was designed to preserve documents for indefinite periods." David, now a major in Army intelligence, was coordinating with Pentagon historians who had arrived with security clearances that allowed them to handle potentially classified materials. His years of specialized training in historical analysis had prepared him for this moment, but even he seemed overwhelmed by the potential significance of what lay buried beneath our feet. "The State Department has confirmed that Operation Looking Glass exists in their classified archives," Emma reported, her diplomatic security clearance allowing her to serve as the official government liaison. "But the files are so highly classified that even senior officials have never seen the complete records. If these documents contain the full operation details, This could be one of the most significant intelligence discoveries in modern history. Tom Bradshaw sat in a folding chair positioned to give him the best view of the excavation, despite his 91 years and failing eyesight. Local news crews had been kept at a respectful distance, but the presence of federal agencies and international observers had made it clear that this was no ordinary archaeological dig. "Your grandmother always said this land held more secrets," Tom said, his voice carrying across the worksite. "But even I never imagined something like this." The excavation took 3 days of careful work to reach the vault, which turned out to be a sophisticated concrete and steel structure, approximately 10 feet square and 8 feet deep. Unlike the simple military container we had discovered 2 decades earlier, this was clearly a purpose-built facility designed to preserve documents of the highest importance for an indefinite period. When the vault was finally opened, using cutting equipment brought by the military team, the contents took everyone's breath away. Instead of a single container, the vault held multiple sealed chambers, each containing different categories of materials. Maps covered the walls, photographs were organized in archival storage systems, and communication equipment from the late 1940s filled an entire section. But it was the central document collection that made even the Pentagon historians gasp in amazement. Operation Looking Glass had been a massive post-war intelligence operation, designed to prevent what intelligence analysts in 1947 had identified as an imminent risk of global nuclear conflict between the United States and Soviet Union. Victoria carefully lifted the first file folder, her hands protected by archival gloves as she read the cover letter aloud. Operation Looking Glass, Final Report, December 1950. Classification level. Above top secret. Primary objective, prevention of third global conflict through strategic intelligence intervention and diplomatic manipulation. The documents revealed that Agent Nightingale had not retired from intelligence work after the war, as we had always believed. Instead, she had been recruited for an even more sensitive operation, leading a network of former World War II operatives who worked to prevent nuclear war during the most dangerous years of the early Cold War. "Look at this," David said, examining a map that showed intelligence networks spanning 4 continents. They were monitoring Soviet nuclear development, but they were also working with Russian operatives who wanted to prevent war just as much as we did. This wasn't just American intelligence. This was a joint operation involving former enemies working together to prevent global destruction. Emma discovered communication logs that showed the extraordinary scope of the operation. They intercepted and prevented 3 separate incidents that could have triggered nuclear war between 1948 and 1950, including one where a Soviet submarine commander was about to launch what he thought were defensive missiles, but which would have been interpreted as a first strike. The photographs told an incredible story of secret meetings, dangerous missions, and quiet heroism on a global scale. Grandma Eleanor appeared in dozens of images, meeting with former German intelligence officers, Russian defectors, and Allied operatives who had chosen to continue their wartime cooperation in service of preventing an even more devastating conflict. But the most remarkable discovery was a personal journal that Grandma Eleanor had kept throughout the operation. Her entries revealed the enormous psychological burden of working to prevent nuclear war while being unable to tell anyone, including her own family, about the ongoing threat to global civilization. January 15, 1949, Victoria read from one entry. "Today we successfully intercepted communications, indicating that Soviet forces in Berlin were preparing to respond to what they believed was an imminent American attack. The intelligence was false, planted by extremist elements who wanted to provoke conflict. We managed to get correct information to both sides before anyone could act on the deception. How many people will never know how close we came to losing everything?" The Swiss bank documents that had been released upon our discovery of the vault provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Operation Looking Glass had involved 847 operatives from 17 countries, all working in secret to prevent nuclear war during the most dangerous period in human history. The operation had been so sensitive that even presidents and prime ministers had been kept in the dark about many of its activities. "The economic implications alone are staggering," Emma said, reviewing financial documents that showed the true scope of the operation. They prevented nuclear war 3 times in 2 years. The economic value of preserving global civilization is literally incalculable. As the sun set on the 3rd day of excavation, we stood surrounded by evidence of the most successful intelligence operation in human history. One that had saved the world from nuclear destruction while remaining completely unknown for over 70 years. Victoria looked at the assembled documents, artifacts, and photographs that revealed our grandmother's role in preventing the end of civilization itself. 20 years ago, I thought this farm was worthless, she said quietly. Now I understand that it was actually the headquarters for the operation that saved the world. The discovery of Operation Looking Glass would require years of analysis and declassification review. But one thing was already clear: the worthless farm that Victoria had once mocked had been the command center for preventing World War III, making it perhaps the most historically significant private property in the world. As we prepared to transport the materials to secure facilities for further study, I realized that Grandma Eleanor's final secret had exceeded even our wildest expectations. She hadn't just been a war hero. She had been instrumental in saving human civilization itself. 6 months after the discovery of Operation Looking Glass, I stood in the United Nations General Assembly in New York City, preparing to address world leaders about the most significant intelligence revelation in modern history. The worthless Tennessee farm that Victoria had once dismissed was now recognized by every major government as the site where human civilization had been saved from nuclear destruction, and the entire world wanted to understand how one woman's secret operation had prevented World War III. The assembly hall was packed beyond capacity, with representatives from 19 countries present for what the Secretary General had called the most important historical briefing in UN history. Victoria sat in the front row of the gallery, her face reflecting a mixture of pride and amazement that still seemed to overwhelm her whenever she contemplated how completely wrong she had been about our inheritance. Distinguished delegates, I began, my voice carrying across the hushed assembly. 20 years ago, my sister and I inherited what appeared to be a worthless farm in rural Tennessee. Today, thanks to the courage and sacrifice of my grandmother, Eleanor Morrison, we stand before you to share the story of how that farm became the command center for preventing nuclear war and saving human civilization. The presentation that followed detailed the extraordinary scope of Operation Looking Glass, using declassified documents, photographs, and maps to show how 47 operatives from 17 countries had worked together in absolute secrecy to prevent global nuclear conflict. The evidence was so compelling that several ambassadors were moved to tears, particularly when I read excerpts from Grandma Eleanor's journal, describing the psychological burden of carrying such enormous responsibility in complete silence. Ambassador Chen Wei from China stood during the question period, his voice respectful but filled with emotion. Mr. Thompson, our newly discovered archives confirm that Chinese intelligence was aware of mysterious interventions that prevented several incidents that could have escalated into global conflict. We never knew who was responsible. On behalf of the People's Republic of China, I want to thank your grandmother posthumously for her role in preserving peace. Similar acknowledgments came from Russia, whose representative revealed that Soviet archives contained references to unknown allies who had provided crucial intelligence during the most dangerous moments of the early Cold War. France announced that they would be awarding Eleanor Morrison their highest civilian honor. Britain declared their intention to make the Heritage Center an official partner with their intelligence museums. But it was the response from younger delegates that proved most meaningful. The representative from Rwanda, herself a survivor of genocide, spoke with particular passion. Mrs. Morrison's story proves that ordinary people can prevent extraordinary tragedies. In my country, we understand the cost of hatred and conflict. To learn that one woman helped prevent global nuclear war gives us hope that individuals can still make a difference in preventing future conflicts. David and Emma watched from the gallery as world leaders competed to honor our grandmother's memory. David, now 28 and serving as a liaison between the Heritage Center and international intelligence agencies, had been instrumental in coordinating the declassification process with governments around the world. Emma, at 26 and recently appointed as a special advisor to the UN's Cultural Heritage Protection Division, was working to establish an international network of peace preservation sites based on our model. The Secretary General himself concluded the session with an announcement that stunned even us. The United Nations is establishing the Eleanor Morrison International Peace Foundation, with an initial endowment of $500 million from member nations, to research and preserve stories of individuals who have worked to prevent conflicts throughout history. The foundation will be headquartered at the Heritage Center in Tennessee, making it the world's first official UN Peace Heritage Site. The global media response was unprecedented. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera and news organizations from dozens of countries ran special documentaries about Operation Looking Glass. The story dominated social media, with Ancient Nightingale trending in over 40 languages. Students around the world began researching their own family histories, inspired by the possibility that their relatives might have their own hidden stories of courage and service. Victoria joined me on the steps of the UN building after the session, both of us overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. The farm she had once wanted to sell to developers was now officially recognized as the most historically significant private property in the world, and our family had become the guardians of humanity's greatest secret. "Marcus," she said, her voice filled with wonder, "do you remember what I said that first day? That the farm was worthless, that you were making the biggest mistake of your life by keeping it." I smiled, thinking back to that morning 20 years earlier, when Victoria had arrived in her BMW, convinced that our grandmother had lost her mind. "I remember, you were pretty certain about the property values." Victoria laughed, but it was filled with emotion rather than humor. "Property values. I was talking about property values while standing on the land where Grandma Eleanor prevented nuclear war. I was so focused on the money that I couldn't see we were inheriting something priceless." Tom Bradshaw, now 91 and traveling with a caretaker but still determined to witness this historic moment, joined us on the UN stage. His presence throughout our 20-year journey had been a constant reminder of the importance of community and the value of ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things. "Your grandmother would be proud," Tom said simply. "She always knew this story would be told eventually. She just had to wait until the world was ready to hear it." The helicopter ride back to Tennessee gave us time to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. Below us, the world continued its daily routines, largely unaware that representatives of every nation had just acknowledged that a small farm in Clarksville had been the site where global civilization had been preserved. The Heritage Center was already being transformed to accommodate its new status as a UN Peace Heritage Site. Construction crews were working around the clock to build facilities that could house the international research teams, diplomatic delegations, and educational programs that would now be headquartered there. As we approached the familiar hills of Tennessee, I could see the memorial garden where everything had begun, the oak trees that had guarded Grandma Eleanor's first secret, and the limestone outcropping where we had discovered her final world-saving revelation. The worthless farm had become the most valuable property on Earth, not because of its financial worth but because of its role in ensuring that there would still be an Earth for future generations to inherit. Tomorrow we would begin the next phase of our journey, transforming our local heritage center into an international symbol of hope, proving that ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things when they choose to serve something greater than themselves. 25 years after Victoria laughed at my inheritance of a worthless farm, I stood once again beneath the ancient oak trees where our extraordinary journey had begun, but this time I wasn't alone with questions and a metal detector. This time I was surrounded by my family, by world leaders, by thousands of visitors from every continent, and by the living legacy of a woman who had taught us the most valuable lesson any family could ever learn, that true worth is never measured in dollars, but in the courage to serve others, even when no one will ever know your name. The occasion was the dedication of the Eleanor Morrison Global Peace Memorial, a magnificent structure that now stood where we had first discovered that buried container 25 years earlier. Representatives from 50 nations had contributed stones from their most sacred sites, granite from Arlington National Cemetery, marble from the Taj Mahal, limestone from the Western Wall, volcanic rock from Hiroshima's Peace Memorial. The memorial represented not just one woman's courage, but humanity's collective commitment to choosing peace over conflict, service over self-interest, and hope over fear. Victoria, now 57 and the Secretary General's Special Envoy for Peace Heritage Preservation,
stood at the podium preparing to deliver the dedication address. Her silver hair caught the Tennessee sunlight as she looked out over a crowd that included presidents, prime ministers, Nobel Peace Prize winners, and students from universities around the world. The transformation from the dismissive attorney who had once mocked this land was so complete that sometimes I could hardly believe we were the same people who had argued about property values a quarter century earlier. 25 years ago, Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly across the memorial grounds. I stood in this exact spot and told my brother that our grandmother's farm was worthless. I was looking at 40 acres of tired land and seeing only financial liability. I couldn't have been more wrong about anything in my entire life. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the assembled crowd. But my mistake taught me the most important lesson I've ever learned, that we live in a world where people measure everything by its price but almost nothing by its true value. We calculate the cost of land, but not the worth of the sacrifice that preserved it. We assess the market value of property, but ignore the priceless legacy of those who served to protect it. In the front row, David and Emma sat with their own children, a new generation that would grow up understanding that their great-great-great-grandmother had saved the world not for recognition or reward, but because it was the right thing to do. David's 5-year-old son clutched a small American flag, while Emma's 3-year-old daughter wore a dress made from fabric that matched the memorial's International Peace banner. Tom Bradshaw, now 96 and one of the oldest living witnesses to our family's remarkable journey, sat in the place of honor beside the memorial. His presence connected this moment to that first day when 3 neighbors had watched in amazement as we uncovered secrets that would change our understanding of courage, sacrifice, and the hidden heroes who walk among us every day. My grandmother Eleanor Morrison kept the greatest secret in human history for over 60 years, Victoria continued. She carried the knowledge that she had helped prevent nuclear war, that she had saved millions of lives, that she had preserved civilization itself. She never told a soul, never sought credit, never asked for recognition. She simply did what needed to be done and then lived quietly among us, letting the world think she was just an ordinary farmwife. The crowd was silent, captivated by the power of a story that had already inspired countless others to look more carefully at the unsung heroes in their own families and community. The Heritage Center's Hidden Heroes project had now identified over 10,000 individuals whose acts of courage had gone unrecognized, proving that Eleanor Morrison's story was not unique. It was simply the first one we had learned to see. But here's what my grandmother understood, that took me 25 years to learn, Victoria said, her voice growing stronger with each word. True wealth isn't what you accumulate for yourself. True wealth is what you give to others. True wealth is the knowledge that your actions made the world safer for children you'll never meet, in countries you'll never visit, in times you'll never see. As Victoria spoke, I thought about all the ways our understanding of inheritance had changed. The money our grandmother had left us, significant as it was, had been spent long ago on building and maintaining the Heritage Center, but the real inheritance, the one that would last forever, was the example she had set and the responsibility she had passed on to us. The Eleanor Morrison International Peace Foundation, now operated heritage centers on 6 continents, had awarded scholarships to over 5,000 students, and had helped prevent 3 international conflicts through quiet diplomatic intervention, based on historical analysis. The worthless farm had become the headquarters for a global movement that proved ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they chose to serve others. Today, as we dedicate this memorial to my grandmother and to all the hidden heroes whose names we may never know, I want to leave you with the most important lesson this family has learned, Victoria said, her voice now carrying the wisdom earned through 25 years of discovery and service. Every one of us inherits something from those who came before us. Sometimes it's money, sometimes it's property, sometimes it's nothing more than a story or a photograph, but the most valuable inheritance any family can leave is not measured in dollars, it's measured in the example of a life lived in service to others. She gestured toward the memorial, where the names of the 84-7 Operation Looking Glass operatives were now inscribed in stone, ensuring their sacrifice would never be forgotten. These people chose to serve in silence, to sacrifice without recognition, to risk everything for strangers they would never meet. They understood that the greatest inheritance we can leave is not what we accumulate, but what we give away. As the ceremony concluded with the playing of a specially composed piece called The Nightingale's Song performed by musicians from around the world, I reflected on how completely our family's story had vindicated a simple truth, that true value is never found in what we possess, but in how we serve. The sun was setting over the Tennessee hills, casting the same golden light that had illuminated this land throughout Grandma Eleanor's long life of hidden service. As thousands of visitors began to disperse, carrying her story back to their own countries and communities, I realized that her greatest victory was not preventing nuclear war, extraordinary as that achievement was. Her greatest victory was teaching us that every ordinary life has the potential for extraordinary impact, that every family has hidden heroes waiting to be discovered, and that the most worthless-looking inheritance might actually be priceless beyond measure. Victoria joined me beneath the oak trees as the memorial grounds grew quiet, both of us thinking about that first day when she had laughed at the idea that this land could be valuable. "You know what I think about most," she said quietly. "It's not the UN recognition, or the International Foundation, or even the fact that we helped preserve Grandma Eleanor's story. It's that somewhere right now, there's probably another family arguing about a worthless inheritance, and they have no idea that they might be standing on ground that could change the world." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, I understood that our grandmother's final lesson was the most important one of all, that the greatest treasures in life are rarely the ones that glitter, and the most valuable inheritance any family can receive is the example of a life lived in service to something greater than oneself. The worthless farm had taught us that true wealth is measured not in what we accumulate, but in what we give away, and that sometimes, the most ordinary-looking legacy contains the power to change everything.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.